I wanted to talk tonight about the role of failure in design and innovation. It's interesting. I think we've hosted these events now for a couple of years. This is the first one where they asked me to talk about it, and I'm trying hard not to draw conclusions from that. But the reality is I've been at this a while, and I've found some really unique ways to fail, and I've failed a lot. So it probably makes me qualified to speak on that. And the reality is I've developed an appreciation for the unique role that failure plays in the field of innovation. I think it bears some direct conversation. And that's really what I wanted to address with you tonight, is the role of failure in innovation. So I teach a class, in fact, to be perfectly candid, I teach Frank Franzik's class at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Frank, who used to teach at UW-Madison, has now moved on to other things. A couple of us teach the class in design innovation at UW-Madison, and I caught an engineer wearing this shirt a couple of times ago. Failure is not an option when you're an engineer. And I can understand the sentiment behind that shirt. It speaks to the pride, the professionalism, the pedigree, the sense of responsibility that a lot of us who are involved in design feel with regards to product design innovation. But if you think about it, it's actually pretty ironic, because the reality is that engineers have found some pretty spectacular and dynamic ways to fail almost as long as we've been doing things, right? And so failure is not an option as an engineer is actually not true. And although these are historical options, the reality is that more recently it doesn't look like we're getting any better. We have all sorts of more sophisticated tools. We have a lot of computer-aided analysis at our disposal. We've got market research like we never had before. And yet we're just finding more and unique ways to fail than ever before. So something's clearly wrong with this picture. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. If you think about it, those failures that make it into the popular vocabulary, the ones that reach the press, they're the ones we hear about, but they're only a microscopic portion of the tremendous number of products that fail for much more pedestrian reasons. They don't work quite as we'd appreciate it, so we set them aside. They're too expensive, so we choose not to buy them. They don't meet the needs that we wanted, or they never make it out of our companies in the first place and get into the marketplace. Those are the real failures that we experience. It's really hard to find true, meaningful statistics on failure. There was a Harvard study a while ago on failure in design innovation that estimated that 80% of all products that are brought into the marketplace will be considered failures. 80%. This slide is old, but it kind of gets to the general point, talks about kind of the progression from how many ideas you have to get to how many successes there are in the marketplace. And the most compelling thing about this slide is the statistic in the kind of the lower part of the text that says almost half of all the time and money that's put into design innovation ends up being put on failed products. Almost half. So those of us who are involved in the field of innovation, our staffs are twice as big as they need to be. Our budgets are twice as big as they need to be. Clearly, it's a pretty compelling problem for us to consider. You're kind of explained or kind of inspired to think, what in the heck is going on here? If you think about the other areas of commerce, we would never tolerate these types of odds in anything else we do. Think, for example, if you and your spouse decide to build a house, you went to a builder and you described the house you wanted, and you had a lot picked out, and you worked with the building, the architect, he came with a price, it's going to be around $200,000, and at the end he said, oh, by the way, there's an 80% chance when we're done with this process that you're not going to be able to move into your house. Okay, we don't accept those types of odds anyplace else in commerce. If we want to build a factory, launch a website, if we'd like to finance a loan, those are all areas where, although success isn't assured, we have a much higher probability when we get to the end that we're kind of going to have sort of what we want that may or may not achieve all of our goals, but at least it'll be there. New product design and development innovation is completely different. So why is that? Well, it's obvious. We live in a highly competitive world, and there's an insatiable desire for us to improve, to do new, to both better our lives, better the experiences of living, improve our companies in a highly competitive environment, and that requires innovation. Innovation means we have to take risk, and the very definition of risk implies failure. It's something we don't always consider. So I actually think it's a fool's errand to try to root out failure from innovation. I sit on a board with an individual from a very large company, national company, And at dinner a couple of years ago, he was bragging that he had never once been involved in a project that had not made it into marketplace. And I had to bite my tongue because in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, anyone who's never had a failed product is never taking a risk, and they're not pushing their company appropriately. So part and parcel to what we do here in innovation is being able to take risk and manage risk. It's inevitable. So part of that, I think, is explained by the fact that design and innovation, designing new products, designing new services, is one of the only things that a company does that involves every single aspect of the company's being, at least from my perspective, just about every aspect. It involves business strategists, conceptualization, design engineering, manufacturing. And if each one of those activities we're pretty good at, let's say we get a 3/4 chance of success, the problem is we've got to stack each and every one of those up sequentially to become successful. Any one of them represents the possibility of being a weak link. I see some people taking pictures. I should have noticed, we'll make this presentation available. But feel free to take pictures if you want, but we can give you a copy as well. So if you take a look at just the mathematical odds of stacking up all these things, even with 3/4% or 3/4 chances of success, when you get to the bottom, the cumulative odds of something being the weak link of the chain is fairly high. So the probability of that being a failure is there. So what are we going to do about this? I mean, if failure is an inevitable part, one thing I guess you could all do is go back to your place of employment and say, I went to a lecture on innovation, and they said innovation is an inevitable part of failure, and failure is an inevitable part of innovation, so we're just going to have to deal with it. And obviously that's not appropriate because there are ways to manage, reduce risk, and that's what I want to spend a little bit time talking about there. So first, let's spend just a little bit of time talking about what I call the context of innovation. We'll start with kind of the when of innovation failure, which is kind of the point from those dramatic examples earlier in the fact that most failures in innovation we never really see. So all innovation isn't created equal, and most companies go through some sort of a process to start with a germ of an idea and end up with a product in the marketplace. And a reasonable approach might be conceptual design or strategic planning, followed by conceptual design, engineering development, manufacturing deployment, and following product launch. And it's also probably fairly evident that one of the things that happens is your costs rise dramatically as time goes on, the costs of failure. The cost of failure during the strategic planning phase is probably fairly insignificant. You haven't marshaled very many resources, you haven't spent much time on it, you really have an opportunity cost, but aside from that, there's really very little capital cost. As you get further and further down the line, the cost of failure becomes more significant. So when we talk about failure, one thing I would postulate is we should separate the cost of failure earlier in the product versus the cost of failure later on in the product. That's sort of the when of failure, which is an interesting taxonomy to start with. So one of the things I would like you to contemplate, I asked you to start this project by thinking of a product or a service that you know of that had failed in the marketplace. And spend a little bit of time thinking about when in the development cycle it should have been apparent that it wasn't going to be a success. So is it a reality that they had to bring it into the marketplace and have the marketplace tell them that it was a failure? Or do you think it's reasonable that somebody in that company that was responsible for that failed product could have determined earlier on that they were riding a dead horse, so to speak? That's the when of failure. Similarly, I think there's also the what of innovation failure, which sort of leads into the fact that the odds of failure instinctually depend on how much reach you're taking on with the product, how far out of the kind of known you're going. And it could run the gamut from what I call kind of new-to-world innovation, where it's a brand new user need, something that either just emerged because people have changed behavior, or something that we just discovered, or maybe it's a new business model or a new technology that's never been envisioned before. And presumably the odds of failure in that type of a situation are pretty high because you're trying to invent something new. It goes all the way down to kind of a facelift of an existing product or service. You're maybe kind of tweaking something. And presumably within your organization, your appetite, your risk for failure for that type of project should be considerably less. So all that makes sense, but I think it's worth contemplating that the odds of failure depend on that product type. And so I would ask you once again to hearken back to that failed product or that failed service that kind of caught your mind and think about, was that failure at least partially explained by how far they reached? And was it somewhat explainable that it was going to be pretty difficult from the onset? The why of innovation failure bears some thought as well. If we've got the when and the what, the why bears equal thought. And It's interesting to think about. As an engineer, I have a tendency to focus on technical failures. They make really dramatic case studies, right? They generally explode or break or end up on the front story. But the reality is that what we do as innovators involves kind of hitting the intersection of three distinct areas of inquiry. We have to design products that are desirable. By that I mean they serve a need in the marketplace. People want them. They add utility to people's lives. I call it desirable, and ostensibly that's the purview of the marketing people, although a topic for a different conversation is my postulation that actually all of us are responsible for that desirable part. Beyond that, they have to be viable, and by that I mean they need to be able to create a sustainable business. They need to be able to be sold for, more money than it costs to produce them. And then they have to be feasible. That is the bailiwick of generally the engineers, the technologists, the software people. Do they work as intended? Each one of these represents a possible area of failure for a product in the marketplace. So for example, desirability, I just pulled three of my favorites, the Segway, the Google Glass, and the Nike Fuel Band are all examples where they got into the marketplace and people really didn't want them. They seemed to work reasonably appropriately. I think they were priced commensurate with kind of what the market would bear, but they didn't really add utility and value in people's lives. From a viability perspective, the spectacular flame out of Munchery, which I think burned through like $500,000 in trying to deliver home food services, the Jawbone subscription-based fitness exercise device, and the beloved General Motors EV1 are all examples of products that worked and actually had a pretty loyal following. People really enjoyed and appreciated those products, but they failed because the companies were incapable of sustaining a business model. If they had priced them at a level at which they were making money, then the demand would have dropped off. So they lacked that viability component. And as we've already talked about, the opportunity for either the Galaxy Note 7 bursting into flames, Toyota's Sun acceleration syndrome, Theranos, which I don't know if it belongs in this category, but I had to put Theranos into the slide someplace. Feasibility just doesn't work, right? I mean, there's products that fail because they just don't deliver on the expectation. So the why of failure is something that we need to spend some time contemplating as well. So I'd ask you to spend just a little bit of time contemplating on that product you fixed earlier. The one that it failed, why did it fail? Did it fail because of customer desire? People didn't want it. Did it fail because it was not financially viable, they couldn't keep the business going, or did it fail because it wasn't technically feasible as well? So sometimes I think failure doesn't really need to be. And it's really interesting. There's this wonderful, is Reiner floating around? Where's Reiner? Well, how do you put it? Schadenfreude? Schadenfreude, the delight of pain in others, right? Is that a delight in others' pain? Yeah, so I think one of the reasons that we enjoy failures, we enjoy reading about Theranos, or we enjoy that, Munchery burned through $500,000, Jawbone raised $750 million and burned through that, is kind of fun to sit in the back and sort of poke fun. The reality is failure's super freaking embarrassing, and I've got some really painful failures from my professional career that left a pretty dark mark. And sometimes, if you dig behind the sort of skin-deep understanding of the failure, you find the stories maybe a little bit more complex. This always draws a smile, the sort of much-loathed Pontiac Aztek. People familiar with this car? I hope this is still, yeah. Institutionalized by Walter White, a Breaking Bad theme, and this is truly an abysmally ugly car. I mean, I'm not a designer, but this is one horrific car, and General Motors absolutely got taken to task for how in the hell did a car like this actually make it in the marketplace. What people forget is that in 1999, so 20 years ago, General Motors debuted the Aztek as a concept car, which was really pretty frickin' cool. And the response behind the Aztek concept car was overwhelmingly positive. Now keep in mind, if you're a car nut like I am, this was before the Honda Element, this was before the Scion XB, all of which were trying to kind of capture that funky crossover, sort of half sport ute, half car. And General Motors just pooched the execution. The concept was great. Even the concept car, I think, I don't know what you think about that. I think that's kind of a gnarly looking car. And somehow they got from that to that. I don't know how they did, well, I probably do know how they did that, but it's a shame. So what I would ask you to consider in your failed product, is it possible the underlying concept was sound and the execution was just poor? And sometimes that's part of the reason as well. Sometimes failure isn't exactly what we think it is. And what do I mean by that? Well, one of the quintessential failure examples that might be in one of your names is New Coke. So New Coke is often cited. Who here is familiar with New Coke? Show of hands, a bunch of people. Okay, for those of you who are not, in the 1990s, Coke was losing market share dramatically to diet soft drinks and to Pepsi. And so the CEO, in a fairly dramatic turn, decided to reformulate Coke. And by all understandings, this may be the most market-tested product on the face of planet Earth. I think they said 150,000 individual market tests on this product, where in a blind taste test, people universally preferred New Coke to the old Coke and New Coke to Pepsi, their primary competitor. And so throwing caution to the wind, as opposed to creating a new brand with a great fanfare, they scrapped the existing Coke and they introduced New Coke, and it was one of the most abysmal failures in the history of all of marketing. New Coke survived a total of 77 days after a multi-billion-dollar manufacturing and marketing campaign. And so in the general lore, it is considered to be one of the most dramatic product failures in history, with the most money spent, the most resources, and the most of a miss. But the thing I think that's really interesting is I went and I did a little bit of investigation in how Coke looks at this particular failure. And what I found is pretty interesting. Here's a quote from Roberto, I can't pronounce his last name. He was the CEO of Coke. He's now retired. Said, and I'll just read this, "The most significant result of New Coke by far was it sent an incredibly powerful signal." And by that he meant just to the company as well as the marketplace, that we're really ready to do whatever was necessary to build value for the owners of our business. Even though it was one of the most dramatic failures that had become the topic of a Harvard case study, he considered to be a success for the company. Going beyond that, the head of marketing of Coke at the time said, yeah, it infuriated the public, cost a ton of money, lasted only a short amount of time, but we considered it a success because it revitalized the brand. And there's a cynical, conspiracy-minded theory of people that say that they actually did this as a publicity stunt, something Coke denies, but the claim is they did this as a publicity stunt to drive awareness in the brand. So sometimes things that we consider to be a failure in the long run, playing the long game, actually end up being a success for the company in some perspective. So the thing I would ask you to consider in the product that you had thought of that was a failure, is there any possibility that ultimately that ended up benefiting the company? Jawbone, I just read, incidentally, just reconstituted themselves with a fresh line of venture investment earlier this year, and they're reinventing themselves as a clinical health and fitness company. So sometimes those failures are really important stepping stones to success. And that's a great segue into my next point, which sometimes failure is just part of the process and a stepping stone to success. We could probably all think of examples of this. Famously, the Apple Lisa, if people remember that product, was an abysmal failure, but established much of the underlying technology that became part of the Macintosh, which of course was one of the most formative computers ever introduced. And although it's easy to look at the Lisa as being a total failure, the fact that it spawned the Macintosh, I think most people would consider that to be an important stepping stone to success. Another one, I have to have lots of automotive examples because I'm such a diehard car guy. So another one that I always like is the Toyota Prius, which if you look at the first generation Prius, introduced in 1997, had a lot of technical reach and a lot of what I would kind of charitably call teething pains. That's what we'd call them in the automobile industry, teething pains. A whole host of recalls and technical problems. Didn't sell very well, 30,000 units. But one thing about Toyota, they play the long game. Toyota's in it for the long haul. And so we've now got the fourth generation Prius, which last year sold 750,000 units. Pretty substantial, right? And I am inspired to think my previous employer, General Motors, what would have happened if they'd stuck with the EV1? Those of you who remember the EV1, first fully electric vehicle, 7 years, 8 years ahead of the formation of Tesla. So the EV1, which was wildly praised by the people who bought it, who loved the car, and General Motors concluded there's no business model in this. They took all the cars back and literally scrapped them, except for a few that went into a museum. And so I'm inclined to wonder, what would the EV7 look like if General Motors had had the courage to consider the EV1 as a stepping stone and stick with it? So, group contemplation, was the company able to build on the failure that you thought of and go on to do bigger and better things? Was it part of a master plan, or did they have the perseverance to sort of stick with it? Another really interesting aspect is how your culture manages failure, and this might be sort of the biggest thing to contemplate of all. Because as I mentioned, failure is expensive, it's messy, it tends to be highly public, it tends to be really easy to scapegoat. And those of us who are designers, engineers, innovators live in fear and terror of being that person at the center of the room where our product hasn't gone quite right. And so a company's ability to manage failure can really affect whether or not we can turn these into positive inflection points or whether or not they end up being devastating. And I don't mean to downplay it. I mean, the benefit of hindsight sometimes makes failure easy to poke fun of. And in the heat of the moment, all companies try to manage to the best they can. But the reality is that how a company internally handles failure can be a really important part of whether you're turning it into an important stepping stone and learning point or whether it really ends up being a dead end. When I was preparing for this talk, I sent out a note asking for comments on failure and the role of failure in innovation to the colleagues at Stanford, where I went to school. And a bunch of really interesting comments back, including one from a very famous tech company that I won't list their name, just to be gracious. And I really appreciate this quote: "Oh my God, you hit a nerve, coming from blank, talking about failure gives me hives. They talk a brave game repeatedly publicly, but they internally subtly punish people for failing, all the while saying that they support it." And his perspective, he's since left the company, is that, yeah, we take moonshots and then we punish people when things don't go intended. I think people are probably familiar with the sort of 6 phases of a project. Seen that before: enthusiasm, disillusionment, panic, search for the guilty, punishment of the innocent, and praise and honors for the non-participants. Sometimes I think this describes innovation. And it's sort of, I guess, discouraging in some aspects that we've picked a career in an area that's so prone to failure. If anybody got into this for the glory, we've all probably picked the wrong profession. But tongue-in-cheek, this does describe some of the barriers to innovation. So all this can be kind of discouraging with regards to the outlook. But I think there is hope, and I think there are things that we can do that can help us control risk, manage failure. So what I wanted to do, to what extent I think, ask you to contemplate, might the internal culture at the company who brought out the product you thought of had contributed to its failure? Maybe at a different company, or slightly more progressive or inclusive or accommodating culture, would that have succeeded? So one of the things I wanted to leave you with, last thing before we do a little bit of Q&A and then get you back to the food and some conversations, is just give you some thoughts on tools and techniques for managing risk, things that I think we can do. I've broken us up into 9 areas that I call acknowledge, front load, align, patience, spirals, fight the hottest fire, parallel path, kill the zombies, and learn. And you can probably deduce what some of these are, but I'll run through these real quickly. The first, as we mentioned, is just to acknowledge the brutal fact of the matter is that we are in a very risk-inherent business, all of us. And so any company culture that doesn't recognize that some aspect of their innovation efforts are going to end up on the cutting room floor, like the films we make, is really diluting themselves. And I think having the honesty to have that conversation, recognizing that they're painful, trying to capitalize on what we can and minimize the loss is a really important part of that. So it's really about, let's talk about risk. Yeah, thank you, the salt and pepper reference. I'm so dating myself here. So let's talk about risk. For those of you who are engineers in the room, the engineers have a wonderful technique they call failure modes effects analysis. I don't know who's here is familiar with this technique. There's a lot to be gained from that and a lot online. And it sounds like a really fancy technique. It is. It's got some structured methodology to it. But the beauty of failure mode effects analysis is it requires a group of engineers to sit in a room and brainstorm all the ways in which a product can go pear-shaped. What are all the ways in which things can go wrong? And then they ask the engineers on a subjective scale of 1 to 10 to rate 3 things. What's the severity? What happens if it goes wrong? Is it an annoyance or does somebody get killed? What's the probability of it occurring? Is it highly improbable or is there a pretty high chance? Once again, being a car guy, a squeak and rattle has a severity of 1 and a probability of 10. My car is going to squeak and rattle, and it's probably going to annoy me a little bit. And the last one is, what's the likelihood that we're going to get this into the marketplace, that we're going to miss this through our development, through our testing, through our prototyping, that we're going to miss this and a flawed product is going to get into the marketplace. You multiply those together, you get a risk priority number. After the end of the brainstorming session, you look at your highest risk priority numbers, and most companies say, it's above a certain level, you got to do something. You can't go into production. And the thing that we found here at Design Concepts is that this FMEA isn't just for engineers. We can do this for business models. We can do this for marketing campaigns. We can do this for conceptual development. But it's really important, I think, to get people into a room and formally acknowledge risk and talk about it. And having participated in many FMEAs as an engineer, I can't tell you how many times I've gotten into a room and had somebody say, "You're worried about that? I didn't know you were worried about that. I didn't know that was going to be a problem." Just acknowledging that can be a really important part. That's the talk part of it. The next of my guidelines or techniques for managing risk is what I call front load. And that gets back to the chart I showed earlier, which is that the cost of failure rises dramatically as we progress. And so logically and intuitively, we want to drive failure or drive attrition, infant mortality, if I can say that, earlier and earlier in the process. So the desired point of failure is much more likely to occur at strategic planning. And by the time we've gotten into a product launch, we burned risk down to 0 and the probability of failure. Now, that's not reasonable, but that's a desire. And one thing I would subjectively say is I don't think the curve really looks like this at most companies because there's sort of the delusional period early in the strategic planning and conceptual design process where we tend to have on rose-colored glasses. So we're very reluctant to look at our projects with a really critical eye, and probably way too many of them survive out of the strategic planning and conceptual design phase than should. And one of the things I would point out is that because not all failure is created early, we should really encourage failure during the strategic planning process. It should be encouraged. If you're not like that individual at that company that said all of his projects make it into the marketplace, if you're not considering some ideas that don't make it into production, that don't make it into the cutting room floor, I don't think you're testing your organization. When you get into conceptual design, you should be expecting failure. Okay, not everything is going to make it. Even if it went through the strategic planning process, we think there's a need, we think there's desire for the product, we think we understand the technology, some things are going to fall through the cracks. The reality of engineering is it's an imprecise profession still, and so some engineering failures, some development failures need to be tolerated. By the time we're putting significant funds either into software deployment, into service delivery, into manufacturing, we should be actively avoiding failure, and the whole objective is to shun failure whenever we get into the marketplace. I'll make a subtle point here. This first part, this is project failure. Project failure is very different than product failure. Okay? When we're in the marketplace, we're talking about product failure. Project failure always has benefits, but it always has downsides, but it generally has benefits as well. There's almost never benefits to product failure in the marketplace. So getting to failure early in the process is really important. That's the front loading. The third part is to align expectations. This ties into the slide earlier about innovation risk and the reality that we have to honestly assess how high is the diving board we've chosen to dive off of. Are we doing something brand new to market? Are we inventing a new technology? Is there a new business model nobody's ever done before? If that's the case, then there has to be a high expectation, high tolerance for risk, and understanding of what the company's betting it on. Conversely, in terms of holding responsibility and accountability for your company, if it's a facelift or an update or a model, there should be a high expectation of success at a much lower tolerance of failure. But having a discussion about this and calibrating your organization's plans and expectations with the type of product you're undertaking is a really good technique for helping moderate and manage risk. The fourth is what I call patience, persistence, and pivots. Okay, and that's the recognition that you're really unlikely with new technology to get it right the first time. It's back to the Toyota Prius example, right? Okay, and I realize it sort of runs a little bit counter to the point number 2, which is front load, let's kill things early. But I think there can be a good strategic plan about recognizing that our first entry into the marketplace is a stepping stone to where we'll ultimately be successful. It gets back to wondering what EV4 would look like if General Motors had stuck with it. You know, it's a really interesting sort of question. The fifth is what I call design spirals, and you can't have a lecture on failure with engineers without people talking about iteration. And it's undeniable that iteration, rapid prototyping, those are the most powerful tools that we have to get things right. But I think iteration, which describes doing the same thing over and over again, maybe isn't the right approach. I really think design spirals is a better technique for talking about this. So we're familiar, many of us, with this sort of getting closer and closer to the desired output by designing something, prototyping it, testing it, repeating it. Designing, prototyping, testing, repeating. Ideally, each cycle we do that should get us closer and closer to the target, tighter and tighter to the target. Anytime I see a design plan that has no rounds of prototyping or one round of prototyping or says we're going to do this once and it's going to go into market and be success, I am highly, highly skeptical. The reality is that spiraling in by burning down risk, defining areas over time is one of the most powerful ways of reducing risk. And so using a spiraling methodology within your development plan represents just good common sense and also good design practice as well. 6 is all about fighting the hottest fire. And we talked earlier about all the different ways in which products can fail. They can fail because they're not desirable, they can fail because they're not feasible, or they can fail because they're not viable. And one really interesting thing that I notice is companies often do a poor job of assessing which one of these areas is the highest risk. And so we're engineers, and when we start a new project, the first thing we start doing is building prototypes. And sometimes that's not where the area of risk lies. Sometimes we build prototypes because we're engineers and that's where the risk, that's what we do as engineers. We start designing things and building prototypes. But the biggest risk is that people might not like it or that we can't make money at it. So there's rapid prototyping tools under all of these areas that you can use to burn down risk. In terms of determining whether or not the product is desirable or not, lean experimentation, for those of you from the sprints, and lean experimentation is a really good technique. There's market research, market tests. If we're worried about viability, we could be testing business model simulations, scenario planning, wargaming, pricing models, sensitivity analysis, all the tools the MBAs have to try to pressure test the business model. And then finally, in the engineering realm, when we start to spend money on rapid prototyping, low fidelity prototyping, virtual prototyping, what are the quickest ways that we can get to test whether or not our idea is feasible? So it really boils down to burning down the hottest fire that you have, trying to honestly assess where's my highest area of risk and making sure that the resources I'm putting early in the prototype are not being wasted on areas that don't particularly matter. And that can be a really effective thing. The 7th area is parallel pathing. And parallel pathing is a technique of identifying those highest risk areas and making sure that you have a fallback plan or a second area that's being developed in concert. So in the event you run into a very significant problem, you can leap off one horse and jump onto the other without having to backtrack. Now there's risks associated with this. It takes significantly additional resources. It can dilute the attention and effort of the firm. And there's a theory that says with too much of a parallel path, we can lose our nerve and fall away from challenging techniques too early. But there's many techniques or many projects that I've been involved with that have gotten to a certain point in time only to realize that a key technology or key assumption they were depending on is fatally flawed. And they have to reset desperately back into the program. And those are ones that would really have benefited from identifying those risk areas and maintaining a parallel path further on down the line. The 8th area is an area I call kill the zombies. And it's a dirty little secret within the innovation world that just about every firm, there's that project that can't quite reach the light of day, but people just can't bring themselves to kind of kill it. Typically, it's a pet project of a senior manager someplace, or we hired Joe to work on that, and it's not an opportunity. No, everybody likes Joe. We don't want to lay off Joe or retrain Joe. So those projects just churn away in the background over months and years and sometimes decades. I see some people laughing. There's probably some zombies at people's companies, right? So part of the technique, I think, is to identify where you've got those things that you just don't have a heart, don't have the heart to drive a stake into, and drive a stake into them and get them done. And killing the zombies can open up fresh resources for areas that really do matter. The last point that I have is probably the most important point, and that's the point of learning. And that's having the courage and discipline to take on the reality that in every one of these instances, there's lessons learned that can make us better. And that doesn't work in a culture that is focused on shame or blaming or recrimination. It only works if organizations are really willing to realize that in every one of these terrible failures, there's probably some really great elements of success. In every one of them, in Theranos, in the EV1, in the Pontiac Aztec, there are probably germs of things that were done really well. I know there's projects that failed here at Design Concepts that I put my heart and soul into it that I still maintain pride on, but they weren't successful. And I think you can feel good about that if you feel your organization learned from that, if it went forward, if it found ways to capitalize on that. So what went right and what deserves to be celebrated? What went wrong and why? And how can we not blame people but prevent that from happening again? What can we learn that can make us better? What are the positives for our firm? We here at Design Concepts call that the post-mortem. And even a failed product, we can benefit greatly. And I think that's one of the best traits of all organizations that capitalize, is being able to learn from those failures. So I'll draw my remarks to a conclusion. We can do a little bit of team Q&A here, and then maybe step upside to enjoy the rest of the refreshments. But I wanted to once again just reiterate the tools and techniques for failure management: acknowledge, front load, alignment, patient persistent pivots, spirals, fighting fires, parallel paths, killing the zombies, and learning. With that in mind, I would just ask you to go forth and fail, but do so elegantly, appropriately, early, and on a very limited basis. Thank you very much.